Welcome to Web3 with A6 and Z. I'm Sonal Chokshi, and today's episode is all about innovation around the world at both a systems and at a people level. So we discuss not only what does and doesn't work in making certain places become hubs of innovation and economic growth, but also discuss what makes entrepreneurial talent, the nature of ambition in helping people find their path, and more broadly, navigating risk, reward, and dynamism in different regions, including London and Europe. My special guest is Matt Clifford, who's played an important role in the London entrepreneurial ecosystem. I actually had Matt on the OG A6 and Z podcast back in 2015, so we also discuss what's changed since then to now, as well as new ways of funding breakthrough R&D, tech trends of interest, and more. For more context, Matt is the chair of Entrepreneur First, which he co-founded with Alice Bentinck over a decade ago. He's also the chair of the UK's Advanced Research and Invention Agency, or ARIA. And before this episode was recorded, Matt was also the Prime Minister's representative for the AI Safety Summit, which he helped organize at Bletchley Park, the historic home of computing in the UK. And then after this episode was recorded, Matt was appointed by the UK Secretary of Science to deliver an AI Opportunities Action Plan to the UK government. This was just announced a few days ago. Anyway, it's all fitting and exciting because we recorded this episode live from Andreessen Horowitz's first international office in London, which we opened late last year. For more on our efforts and other content from and about there, go to a6nzcrypto.com/UK. As a reminder, none of the following should be taken as investment, legal, business, or tax advice. Please see a6nz.com/disclosures for more important information, including a link to a list of our investments. Now, on to the episode. Matt, welcome.
It's great to be here. It was great to be back. We were just saying.
Yes, I was about to say, we did a podcast together. You were on this podcast on our last run in roadshow, which was 2015.
Yeah.
And you were that was the very first time we met in person.
It was. I mean, we've been going a while now, and we'll probably talk about is how the London ecosystem has grown. But our initial thesis, which we remain very dedicated to, is that the world's missing out on some of its best founders. In Silicon Valley, if you're ambitious and smart, it's the most obvious thing in the world to start a company.
Right.
In Europe, that's still not true. If you go around Oxford or Cambridge or Imperial College, any of these great universities, and you say, what are the smartest, most ambitious people want to do? Yeah, more and more it's on the agenda, but it's still probably banking, consulting, big companies.
I don't know how you describe EF or Entrepreneur First as an org.
We call ourselves, the thing we've lighted on after a lot of iteration is we're a talent investor. We invest in people before they have companies and help them go through that 0 to 1 journey. We're taking people who purely on the basis of who they are, we think we want to make a bet on.
I like that you're saying that you're a talent investor. I mean, VCs and creatives, anyone would say that's their job, is investing in talent. And that's an art, not a science.
Yeah. Well, I know that Mark and Ben have taken a lot of inspiration in building your firm from talent agencies.
Yes, the CAA that was inspired by Michael Ovitz.
Exactly.
He was an advisor early on.
And we have a sort of similar view that almost like the world's most talented and ambitious people need agents. I mean, that's not quite how we frame it.
It's really fascinating because you said you're not an agency, neither are we, because actually the model obviously was talent focused, but it was more about a network and network of networks, which is how we used to think a little bit. I mean, I don't know if that was ever formally how it was described, but at least from my perspective, I used to think of A6 and Z when I joined in the early days, which is now a decade ago, as a network of networks. Yeah. And that was where the Ovitz model came in, which is how do you sort of, kind of give back, continue cultivating talent. So in that way, growing people even before they want the thing or even helping them so it's not transactional.
Exactly. And a lot of what we talk about is our team's job is to go out and find extraordinary people who are still figuring out what to do with their lives. My co-founder Alice and I, we started our career as management consultants. We were at McKinsey, and in many ways it was a really great experience. But if you say why did you end up there? It wasn't because at 6 years old I was running around the kitchen being Mommy, I want to be a management consultant. It's just it was the path. It was what people did in whatever it was, 2008 when I graduated. And so, our view was if you really want to move the needle on increasing the supply of great founders, you can't wait for them to figure out that that's the obvious path. You have to create a path. And that's what Entrepreneur First has been about from the beginning. One of the things that we think about a lot is the nature of ambition and how it's very culturally determined.
Ooh, let's talk about that.
Well, what I mean by that is it's not like all ambitious people have the same vision of how to realize their ambition.
That's absolutely true.
And so it would be the craziest thing in the world to try and force people to be entrepreneurs. we have quite a big team now around the world, and they go out and they find people who are clearly extraordinarily talented, but at the very start of their journey, we typically focus on people early in their career, sometimes like, while they're at university or equivalent. And, their job, yes, obviously, is to help them think about startups. And, if they want to build a startup, bring them into our community and help them do that. But their job is not to push where it's not right. It's to genuinely be almost like a career counselor, like an actual, like someone whose interest is shared with the person. And so, one of the things that we believe, like, if you like, our theory of change is that if you can like actually intervene at a point where people are trying to figure out like, how do I have this talent? How do I maximize my impact in the world? And you can show them this path of entrepreneurship and show what's possible, then actually that will increase the supply of great founders and then great companies in the world.
So I do want to pick up a little bit on two threads. One about this, what you said about the nature of ambition, something you think about a lot, but also what you said about this culturally determined aspect of it. And that to me suggests some of the structural context, the surrounding context that supports entrepreneurship beyond the individual. So let's split it up into the people and then the surrounding kind of context and ecosystem.
Yeah.
So on the surrounding context and ecosystem, one kind of obvious thing, this is something we talked about a lot in the early day in the A6Z podcast. I recorded a lot of episodes with like Iranian entrepreneurs and various people around the world. And it was really fascinating how the risk tolerance is very different culturally in different regions.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think it's so cliche, but it is true for a reason, is unique about Silicon Valley is there is a tremendous tolerance. I don't want to say the word failure because I hate veering into failure porn. I think that's the
totally
wrong
agree.
way to, it's like actually.
Failure sucks always.
Oh my God. Well, I hate when people are like failure Friday and failure this. Like, yes, of course, normalize talking about it, recovering, repairing, but don't like glorify failure for God's sake. Everyone wants to succeed. But what's really interesting about it is that there is like this forgiveness and recovery and resilience that whereas in certain cultural regions and areas, there's almost like a punishment or a feeling of self-hatred if you don't succeed. This is even beyond individual level. I'm talking about like culturally.
Yeah, totally. So I think there's two things. One is attitudes to failure, but I think it's also like what is valued, like what is esteemed. And I think the really special thing about Silicon Valley is this this idea that if you're in Silicon Valley and you tell someone you're a founder, that immediately has a set of connotations that are almost exclusively positive.
Yes.
It's very legible. People know what you mean. People can read that as a sign that you are ambitious.
That's right.
When we started Entrepreneur First, there was this slight sense that if you said you were a founder, that was a euphemism for you were unemployed.
Yeah.
And so actually, I think the cultural meaning of entrepreneurship is one of the biggest sources of leverage you have. Just like making it like, this is a thing that smart, capable, ambitious people do. Yeah. And it's a vehicle for changing the world. It's such a powerful idea. And, to give you a really concrete example, because I think like, in the UK, in the US, like we, similar enough systems that it really resonates. But, the first international office we opened was in Singapore. And in Singapore, the number one career path for the smartest, most ambitious people is to go be a civil servant. As a result, the government of Singapore is probably one of the most effective and efficient.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that because it's actually the opposite in so many other places.
I've just been serving in government, and actually the people have been amazing. So, but I would say, like, as a result, the cultural value of entrepreneurship in Singapore it's just been very. I think it's been harder there to sort of like create this sense that like if you say you're a founder, you're doing something that's as like legitimate, as prestigious as your friends that have gone off to be,
Yes. We should talk for a second about why entrepreneurship for a minute, because it seems like an obvious thing. Like, what are we talking about? This is a show, the startup focus. We're both startup focused cultures, but actually it's not obvious.
It's not obvious.
I mean, if I were telling a policymaker, I think they know this, but like the reality is like startups represent innovation. They're an engine of growth. They create jobs. They're generative. They're not extractive. They're not just taking the stable, what you already have that's established. They set you up for the future. I mean, there's layers and layers of why this matters. So just to kind of hit on that. But to your point, so I have to ask you this then. I don't want to be stereotypical, but of course there's going to be some generalizations just to kind of understand this. But my impression of London, I'm born and raised in the United States, but my grandparents settled in London. This is in the 70s, before I was born. And the impression I got from culturally is that there's kind of like, I don't want to say classist, but very much a credentialist society. Like you care very much about what school you went to. And I think that could be true in some ways of Silicon Valley, but people kind of don't really care what school you went to or what you did. Would you say that is true today? Do you think that's evolving? And I'm bringing this up because you mentioned this point about what value that certain words and these concepts signal. So I'm curious for your perspective there.
One of the essays that I wrote when we were early on in EF that was trying to talk to this, I called Don't Be a Badge Collector. I think I probably wrote that around the time I was first on the podcast. But I think it's held up pretty well. And, what I was saying is I think there is a cultural temptation, let's call it, in the UK to be like, I'm going to work really hard to get into the best university I can so I can get the best graduate job I can. So I can, one of the biggest risks for smart people, I think, is that you get into a mode where success is measured by whether you make your boss look good. And their success is measured by whether they make their boss look good. And seeing all the way up, what you're actually doing, to your point about, you mentioned startups are a positive sum game. There's a risk in a lot of career tracks that I'm not saying you're not creating value, but your actual goal is to win the upward political battle within whatever bureaucratic structure you're in, right? And that's when I say political, I mean small p. I mean, this can be in big corporates, it can be in whatever. I think what's beautiful about startups, and the reason I've spent more or less my entire career helping people build them, is that they're ultimately all about what you can do for other people.
That's a fantastic way of framing it.
You only succeed if you build something that is so valuable that someone else will pay for it.
Yes.
You cannot win in any other way. There is no boss to make it look good. There is no grading scheme that some teacher is going to tell you got an A on.
Yes.
It's comes down to this very stark thing. Did you do something for someone else that they thought was so great?
Right.
They wrote you a check.
That's right. And it is not people pleasing because often you're going against established convention.
Absolutely.
You're often butting your head or punching through an industry that is not accepting a new way of doing things. I'm just thinking of my former partner, Martin Casado, on the enterprise team. When he was doing software-defined networking, he was punching against very established old school methods for what networking looked like. That was very hardware-based. And so it's you have to literally punch, you're completely going against all conventions.
The bar is so high to actually prove that value is. And I do think, I sometimes think, one of the challenges we face today is that if you are smart and ambitious, it's now so easy in some senses to find a comfortable path that is about making your boss look good all the way through a career and acquiring money and influence and prestige, but actually maybe never really doing something that creates an enormous amount of value, I
mean, it seems, now that you say it, it seems so obvious, but it's really not. Just a pause on the idea, when you're doing a startup, you're building something that other people want and need. That's a really profound idea. On that note, it's also very fascinating because of the economics of startups, because usually if you're working for a company, you were talking about you and Alice being at McKinsey, consulting, people think they're making good money, but you're really captive to your salary. You're not actually, the wealth is not generative. And one thing that I find really powerful about startups is that startups are the ones that innovated on the idea that employees can have a share of the returns on the work they do. So even though you might be building a product for customers and consumers that people want, if you succeed, it can also go to nothing, obviously. That's a very real risk. But if you succeed, there can be very real gains for the people who put things in, especially for those that took a risk early on. I don't know how the options and the economics work in UK startups, but that is, I think, a defining feature of Silicon Valley in the early days. And so I just wanted to point that out because it's actually resonant to what you said about not only pleasing people and being captive, but you're also helping other people and then actually creating value that for the employees too. They're always increasing the size of the pie for everyone in some form. So, I mean, not to be cliche, but that's very true.
In a way, I think there's a really important sort of ethical point here, which is that founders, they can make a lot of money, but they only get to capture value that they create.
That's right.
And, I think that is actually a really important idea. And I find, again, we focus mainly on people early in their career when we're working with founders. And, I just think that idea really resonates with people that, they of course they would like to be successful, but they want to do it within a framework where they feel they created something.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, otherwise it's just gambling.
Or extraction.
Extraction, exactly. It's like value add versus value extraction.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, it's funny because it's also, you know, I don't want to get like at all political, but just like in terms of capitalism, stakeholders, people having a voice and empowerment. I saw this list. It periodically makes its round on Twitter of like people, like the most wealthy families in Europe. And that list of the top 5 has not changed over centuries.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because that just means it's generational wealth passing along. Whereas in the United States, that list is, I mean, granted, it's a younger country, but at the same time, like, it's like the list is changing constantly. Like the top 10 wealthy people, the top 5 wealthy people. And again, it's not about the money. I don't want to make that the focus, but just pointing out that when you think of this dynamism, this thing that a culture can change, be advanced, add new value, startups can be generative. It's just really interesting to me because a lot of those people are startup made. Like most of those people are not access to old money.
Right. And you know, I think, again, not wanting to be political, but, you know, actually the thing that I think is nonpartisan and everyone can agree on is that actually the thing we need is positive sum games.
Oh,
you know,
100%.
Like, you know, the thing, you know, like different people have different views on, you know, like how we tax wealth and, you know, but the bit that everyone can agree on is if people, what we want to reward in society is people that are creating valuable things. We don't want to reward extraction. And, you know, one of the beautiful things about startups is they can't extract, they got to create. And I think there's just something very valuable about that and very powerful that actually I see people across the political spectrum sort of, you know, kind of get in behind.
Yes, I agree. On this note, though, we're talking about the structural context right now before we move to the individual. So let's add a little rigor to like, what does an ecosystem need? Because I know that can be very buzzword. I've studied entrepreneurial ecosystems for a very long time, covered them for a very long time, as you know. And, you know, including like interviewing all these different people throughout the world who are experts in this, like what an ecosystem means. And a couple of themes emerge. One, you obviously need talent. You need really strong universities and research ecosystem. You also need, for the people that hate to admit this, government support. So the other thing is there's a really important balance between top down and bottom up.
Totally.
And on the bottom up side, you obviously need communities of entrepreneurs because there have been, as you know, many experiments, including planned cities, planned innovations, like where people are trying to do these centrally planned top down innovation initiatives. They never work. Ever. There have been many, many, many over the years, and not one has worked. Some argue Singapore, that's a different, unique, complex case, and I don't know if it's as, quote, entrepreneurial. It's a successful nation state,
right?
But that's a separate thing. So that's one aspect. Secondly, on the top-down side, you obviously need enabling conditions like respect for property. Like in the U.S., we talk about respect for property rights. It can include respect for intellectual property. It can include support such as funding, like DARPA in the United States, which funded the internet. Things like that, supportive pro-innovation policies. So the bottom-up side is a community, the top-down, and then obviously the talent that comes in the form of universities, because universities are drivers of research and innovation. So now, on your point about the science and technology side, talk to me about what you think is happening uniquely in London, because we're sitting here.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned DARPA. You know, my sort of side hustle outside Entrepreneur First is I'm the non-executive chair of ARIA, which is a new government-backed or government-funded R&D funding agencies based on DARPA, basically.
So what does ARIA stand for?
ARIA stands for the Advanced Research and Invention Agency.
I know what you're talking about. Okay,
so it's been given, I guess in US terms, about $1 billion to basically fund breakthrough R&D that might otherwise not get funded. So really trying to take some of what worked at DARPA, in particular this idea of like this program manager-led model of empowering brilliant scientists with visions to just go out and build the networks and coalitions of researchers to realize that vision.
That's right.
In a way that's like all about, actually a lot of things we've already been talking about. It's about ambition, it's about incentives, it's about alignment, all these things. And, you know, one of the things that's been really striking to me in the sort of roughly year that we've been up and running is, one, just the depth of the scientific talent across the whole UK. So not just London or not just Oxford and Cambridge, but you know, truly across the whole country. Two, it's almost like too strong a word, but like the yearning for something like this.
Wow.
You know, well, when you look at, you know, like, why does ARIA need to exist? You know, we do a ton of great science in the UK, and actually, you know, I'm lucky to have been involved in a lot of the science funding organizations that exist. But I think one of the challenges is that with scale comes, you know, sort of more bureaucratic approach, right?
Yes.
And so if you're trying to run science funding for a whole country, of course you need to like show value for money for taxpayers, and you need to sort of have a lot of process. But the consequence of that, this is not a UK thing, this is a global thing. And people like Patrick Collison and others have written about like the challenges of where science has got to. I think of it as a career ambition and incentive problem. So if you go talk to like incredible postdocs across the UK, across the US, and you say like, what's your most ambitious idea? And they tell you. And then you say, cool, and so you're working on that? They're like, no. You're like, why not? Like, if they're, and you're like, well, because I need to get this next publication, which needs to get this many citations, because then I'll be able to get my next grant. And if I do that, then one day I'll be able in 10 years to get my own lab. And you're like, wow, this is crazy. We have some of the greatest minds of their generation playing a bit like the making your boss look good game. This is the making the grant makers happy game.
That's exactly the same thing. I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is important. So I want to break down a little bit more about what you're saying, because a lot of people have tried different forms of like how to fund R&D and do it in a way, an industrial R&D is what you're talking about, and in a way that's efficient. And a lot of the lessons learned here, which I think are fascinating. So one, you mentioned the concept of a program manager.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, like DARPA had these famous model where they had program managers, and it's quite fascinating because like one example is Regina George, and she went to Google later on. But I remember being at Xerox PARC when her group funded, and this is public, Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, and like reconfiguring manufacturing and all these different things. And there's so many different interesting things about it because one, first of all, many of these initiatives can be very multidisciplinary, which universities are not well set up to do, where people are very siloed in their departments. And so having these grants can sometimes be like kind of these umbrellas for different disciplines to come together, including across multiple universities.
Yeah, I was going to say multiple universities, and sometimes even different sectors.
That's right.
Like universities and startups.
That's right.
And
that's right.
nonprofits or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
No, totally. Like one example was back in the day, we did like content-centric networking. Like it was like, various types of things. So that's one interesting thing. The second thing, this is a very little known fact that people don't know about this model is, and I remember being fascinated by this when I was working with my colleagues, like helping them out with some stuff at SRI who were thinking about this, which is Stanford Research International. And they're very famous for getting lots of research grants and different things. It's fascinating because most people, when they think of government funding and program managers, they think of it as being as a one-way model where government gives money, program manager allocates it, someone has a strong point of view, and it goes A, B, C, D. It's actually much more nonlinear and interactive than that, where you actually have smart scientists informing the program managers for what proposals they want to see. Because actually the word in the grant making business is if you're bidding on an RFP, request for proposal, by the time it comes out, you're too late.
Right.
You should be shaping what proposals are coming out in the first place. And that is a two-way dialogue between government and universities.
And that's a big part of how ARIA is working and planning to work is that, but hopefully in an extremely transparent way, which is say, here is an area that we're excited about where we think there is a thesis. Before we like make grants, before we do an RFP, we want to like workshop this with people that have like a really broad range of views on it.
That's right.
So that we know like, what are the things we should be looking out for? I mean, there's a risk of a cliche here, but so much of the challenge of this stuff is you don't know what you don't know. And
that's exactly
particularly
right.
across into, like disciplinary boundaries. There's a lot of academic literature that suggests that surprise is the key to scientific breakthrough.
Right.
Surprise comes when you have a different knowledge base or perspective.
Yeah. At Xerox PARC, JSB, who's John Seely Brown, who used to manage it back in the day, used to always say it's at the interstitials, like at the edges and like 100%. These kind of in between industries. I mean, I do think that surprise or serendipity is very important, but I want to be careful that we don't glorify like innovation as like this aha eureka moment when it's many little things that can come together incrementally. And I actually think, but tell me if I'm wrong, when you say surprise, you also mean this emergent quality that you don't know what you said, what you don't know, and it can actually come up bottom up because you're not top down saying, like you can say, we know this is an interesting area. You may even have a loose thesis, but you don't have it so opinionated and targeted that you're literally veering into central planning, which is where I would say places like China fail.
Totally. When I'm talking about surprise, I'm talking about almost exclusively a bottom-up phenomenon. Like what happens when the biologist talks to the computer scientist about a problem that has a rough with the same contours and they never realized before the biologist, and then you're like, oh, and like, that can be an incredibly productive thing.
You were preaching to the choir, because whenever I used to give tours, that wasn't my job, but because I was the head of editorial at Park, I did give like these muckety mucks, like the tours every now and then. And it was funny because one of the messages, it's so true, because they'd always ask, like, how did this one place, not just once, not a one-hit wonder, repeatedly create one innovation? And we're talking world-changing innovations.
Absolutely.
Ethernet.
Absolutely.
Like, I can't even say the GUI, like there was endless lists of things that they did, lasers, like, and the big part of it had to do with this multidisciplinary
100%.
thing and putting them in the same thing. But here's the other thing that people don't know, and this ties what we're talking about. It wasn't just you put a bunch of smart people from different disciplines in one building and go, hey, collaborate. The founder of Xerox PARC gave them a mission, and the mission was to build the office of the future. It's a very simple mission, broad enough to enable all kinds of innovation, yet specific enough to provide a funnel so it's not like Crazy Town, where people are like, oh, I want to build a sneaker that like rolls down the hallways and I can skate through the, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah, totally. 100%. I think that idea of mission, I mean, that's the other bit that, Ilan, our CEO, ARIA, has, I think one of the reasons I'm so happy he's doing that job is that just the sense of mission he has about what we're trying to do is just so palpable.
That's powerful. How did ARIA come about? Like, so did the government approach you guys? Did you guys approach the government? How did this come about?
Yeah, the government created this by act of parliament early in 2022, and then ran an open process to hire a CEO and a chair. And, I had been, partly mainly because of the work I've been on at EF, I'd been very interested in this idea of like, how do you do institutional innovation? Because it's not the same as VC. It's not an incubator. It's not an accelerator. So, I've always been interested in this, like, how do you do institutional innovation to increase the supply of things that you want?
Yeah.
And in a way, EF is like trying to increase the supply of great founders. ARIA is trying to increase the supply of scientific breakthroughs through this sort of institutional innovation. And so I just applied, and slightly to my surprise, I got the job.
I'm not surprised.
I mean, Ilan was based over near Home for You, who's in Berkeley, and he was running this incredible thing called the Activate Fellowship, which is like a deep for deep tech entrepreneurs out of academia.
What I think is very fascinating about you being involved is the other part of having these, when you said their goal was to increase the number of scientific breakthroughs. The other half of it is how do you then actually take those breakthroughs and make something of them? Because as you know, there's no shortage of brilliant ideas and things coming out, but there has to be like a system that can absorb and
100%.
help support and nurture it. And so I think it's fascinating that you're involved, because then it's also like, wait, you don't only have to go through like this classic linear model of university funding X. You may also be able to do a startup.
Definitely.
You may collaborate with a big company.
Yeah.
You could go here. A big company can acquire the patent. There's such a variety.
Yeah. It's interesting that you landed on that, because I would say like, probably the most important strategic question we've had to answer for ARIA so far is who's the customer? So, if you think about DARPA,
right,
the D is defense. And it's pretty important. Like, they've done a good job of doing this sort of like bottom-up side of it, but there is a big
there is top-down,
they are building things that the Department of Defense ultimately wants
the internet was originally invented to be resilient in the case of a disaster, right? And of course it became something else, but as is the case, but
and we are not Daria, we are ARIA. We don't have a big customer, and that was a big important decision.
Interesting.
Not to be. We are of government, but we're very independent of it. We're what we call in the UK a non-departmental public body, which basically means we're outside government.
Got it.
And so, the question that Ilan rightly asked right at the beginning is, we're not going to have a customer. So, what is the exit path? Like, we find something great. What do we do with it? And the answer is probably not surprising, given that they appointed an entrepreneur as CEO and an entrepreneur as chair, is we think the answer is scientific entrepreneurship. And Ilan's answer to this is we need to make sure that the interface between ARIA and the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, is really porous in both directions.
I agree. Both directions is a key word.
Yeah.
I love that you guys say scientific entrepreneurship, because our tagline, I've said this publicly in talks, our 2-word phrase at Xerox PARC was entrepreneurial scientists.
Right.
So scientists who are entrepreneurial but are not actually starting startups.
Yes.
And they have this kind of entrepreneurial mindset. There's a reason they're not in academia. There's a reason they're not in industry. They're in between. They're a really unique interface. So I think that's fascinating. We don't have to talk about this right now, but just one other quick note is, there's also important to make sure process doesn't get in the way. Because one piece I did edit was Patrick Hsu and Tyler Cohen on the FAST grants. And one key insight, and this obviously came out of the pandemic, is that sometimes you also have to deploy capital quickly.
Yeah.
And sometimes in government, process, and there's a good reason for it, can get in the way of doing that from allocating funding.
I mean, that's been like core to how we think about this. Like, how do we get out of the way? And, like one of the reasons I think DARPA has succeeded is like there's very few veto points.
Yeah.
It's not like you have to get like 12 people to say yes.
Yeah.
And we've done something very similar at ARIA. The program directors have to convince the land, basically.
Yeah.
And, my job as the chair of the board is to like scrutinize the whole, but not get into the weeds, not be another veto
That's
point.
fantastic. I'm glad you guys are aware of that. So now let's shift back to the individual. We've talked about the structural. You said something incredibly fascinating earlier, which is how you're obsessed with ambition and this question of ambition. You also said another really beautiful, profound, powerful word, which is yearning. This idea that people have this yearning. And the reason that struck me is because when you talk about how you guys are actually trying to support people early in the pipeline to become entrepreneurs and know that's a path for them, what really struck me is it's fascinating that you even have to do that we should even have to do that culturally and societally. Because if you really think about it, children are born creative and are born entrepreneurial. X, Y, and Z, or let's trade on the school thing. Let's trade lunches. I'll give you 2 pretzels for 1 Kit Kat, whatever it is. It's commerce. Sometimes it's about building things together on the playground. So I think there's something kind of sad that people lose that impetus. And one question I have for you from your unique vantage point at Entrepreneur First is, when you say you try to get people early, what is a sweet spot that when you say like earlier in their career? Like, is it right as they're in their high school, college? Like,
well, in London, we have 2 tracks, and actually same in Paris. So we operate in London, in Paris, in Bangalore, and in New York. And the 2 tracks we have is we have a track for people as they graduate from university.
Yeah.
And then we have a track for people we don't put a hard limit on it, but the first 5 years of their career. So they've got a little bit of work experience. But not
got
much.
it.
I think like those 2 moments are quite special moments. Like as well as yearning and ambition. Another word we think about a lot is becoming.
Oh, becoming.
Like
Look at you, I love it.
I'm very influenced by my colleague Arnaud Schenk, who's a brilliant guy who runs a program for us
I
called
love
Polaris.
him. He's on our chat group with us.
Yeah, he is, exactly. And
and Saloni and some others.
He's really convinced me of this, that like ambitious people have a sense of who they want to become, but often less of a sense of how.
So they know who, but not how.
And so like a big part of ES role is to try and help people become the person they want to be.
That's so interesting. So Mark used to always say in the early days when people would ask him, like, there are 3 pools for a startup. It's product, it's market, it's people. And he would always say that people is the one you bet on the most, because product can change, market can change, and that can actually sometimes be a lagging versus a leading indicator. But people are where you can really find that sort of, true north, the sort of cutting forward, which the differential that you're looking for in that kind of a business. That's really interesting. So what I like about what you're saying, because my question, you've answered it, is very precise, which is, at what point do you kind of intervene, so to speak?
Yeah.
And what you're saying is by doing it in college and the early 5 years of their first job, that is the how. Because they have a sense of what.
Yeah.
Because my argument was going to be like, why not do it sooner?
Yeah.
Like, in crypto, for instance, we're actually seeing high schoolers, they're obsessed. Like, they want to learn. And it's not for financial reasons. It's building, it's creativity, it's like expression.
No, we're the same. We want to engage with people early. And, the thing that keeps it very grounded is that it's really about like, what is the community? What is the infrastructure that you can provide to people that helps them figure this out for themselves? We're not a cult. We're not trying to tell them who to become. But, it's like, how can we sort of provide a peer group that makes people say, actually, the way I don't want to be a banker. I don't want to go work in a 100,000 person big tech company. And now I've found my people. I found the people that not only validate that sense, but actually can help me get there.
You also need like support if you're struggling with trying to figure something out because you're not alone.
And it's the feeling that your choices are valid. I mean, it sounds so basic. There's so much to figure out, right?
Right, because you don't have the structure of like a classic top-down company, bottom-up thing. The other quick thing is that this reminds me again of childhood development, because there's a body of work that says that it's not the parents, it's nature-nurture debates, but it's actually the peer group that defines your development the most. This is a very controversial and very important body of work from Judith Harris in like the aughts. And it was a very important movement in child psychology and development. So just on this note, so as you do this work, and we were talking about how hard it is to have this, like, you know, this you want to harness people's ambition. Are there any icons you think that people need? Because in the U.S., the Social Network movie was a moment.
I think it made
a
huge difference.
Right, like the Zucks, and because the other thing is this capital gap early on, where people can get angel funding, but not like the next phase. I would argue that's a similar thing in the talent game for building a company, where you can find like the early employees, but not the people who can scale it.
I think that's still the gap.
That's still a gap.
I think that, and I think it's closing, but it's closing more slowly because it just takes longer because you need those companies to have matured and exist. But you know, I think this is also why this like idea of ambition should be global from day one. Like, yes, we want there to be a great ecosystem in London, but we're not nationalists.
That's a great point.
You know, when I think about EF's best companies, the ones that are scaling fast, they're the ones that are embraced having to be US companies as well as British companies.
Yes, I totally agree. So going back to the structural context, before we go more into people, because I do want to drill with you on the talent side more, but on the more structural ecosystem context. So, you know, we talked like, again, over 7 years ago, very exciting. You've come a very long way, very proud of the work that you and Alice and your team have done at Entrepreneur First. But like, you also have a unique vantage point given your work into the London ecosystem and the tech ecosystem. So what are your views on what's working, what's not working at a high level, and then what's really changed? I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of fun that we're doing this again after 7 years.
Well, you know, it's so funny because, and I think this is a thing that a lot of entrepreneurs wrestle with. I remember when we started, we were so convinced we were too late. We left our jobs in 2011. I mean, it took a little bit of iteration for EF to become what it is now. But, you know, I remember in 2011, we were like, maybe we just, you know, like maybe this ecosystem is saturated. And I just look back now and I'm like, I think there was like one organization describing itself as a seed fund. When we do demo days today, you know, you get like 2,000 people or, you know, like, so the ecosystem has grown massively.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that's true at like every layer of the stack, if you like. You know, I think the talent, you know, we already talked a little bit about how attitude of like young talent has changed, but also the proliferation of angel investors, seed funds. And then the bit that I'm excited about more recently, and I guess this is sort of you guys coming here and opening an office is a good example of this, is that for a long, long time, people talked about like the capital gap in the UK ecosystem, that, you could raise a seed round, maybe a Series A, but, you know, Series B was really hard. And, you know, like, there's a way to go, but both in terms of like local firms growing up and, you know, kind of building reputations and track records, but also, you know, the sort of most famous and storied American firms coming here. I think that's a huge net positive for the ecosystem.
Yeah, so that's more a difference of degree, though, than kind. Like in terms of you're saying there's more investors, more capital available, more people doing things, more entrepreneurs. Would you say there's any differences in kind?
I think the difference in kind I would most point to, and it's going to seem like I'm obsessed with this theme, but it's just about ambition.
I love it. I like that obsession. I'm on board with that theme.
I remember when we got started in 2011, one of the things we heard, there were some really ambitious startups, you know, back then. You know, in fact, I remember that when we recorded our podcast 7 years ago, or whenever it was,
I think it might even be almost 8 years ago. Maybe 9, who knows at this point.
One of my fellow guests on that was Michelle Yu, who was one of the founders of Songcake.
Yeah.
Now that was one of the first, like, real first generation London startups, and was super ambitious, but they were unusual. You know, like most 2011 London startups arguably were sort of like trying to get bought.
That's right. That was their exit strategy, was to be quiet, not really grow big and at massive scale.
Yeah, no, and that's not a criticism of those founders. I think it's a lot about like what what sort of ambition will an ecosystem support?
That's right.
And so the difference of kind I would point out is that I think we now have people who are truly trying to build the global category winner from London, from the UK. Now, we're not there yet, we're still, it's amazing what, Daniel has done at Spotify and, but in general, we're still, ADN, there are some really extraordinary European success stories, but, I think we're still sort of pointing to things that happened a little while ago.
Yes.
But I do get the sense, and maybe crypto is an area where this might happen, where I do think that 10 years from now we'll look back and say, the early 2020s was actually a pretty special time to build globally ambitious companies from Europe.
I'm so glad you brought up crypto, because when I think of crypto, this goes back to the earlier point about the positive sum game and the incentives. It's really about incentive mechanisms and incentive alignment. And that's actually the beautiful thing about crypto is it bakes these things in structurally. So there's a lot of ways to align different parties of people together to build things. So I kind of agree with you that this could be a very unique time.
Well, I think one of the exciting things about crypto from a geographic perspective is that it is sort of like natively global. It's not one of those things where you look to a domestic market and then expand.
That's exactly right.
And, when I think about two of the crypto companies that we've invested in together, Andreessen Horowitz and Entrepreneur First, Jensen and Aztec, I think what you see is like, these are people trying to build infrastructure for a different world.
Yes.
But they're not building it for London or the UK or for Europe.
Yes.
Like, it is inherently global.
Yes, we had MC Later, COO of Uniswap on, and she was saying how this is a really unique type of product launch because you're instantly global when you, like most other times you used to have, like you're saying, these regions, you would land and expand in this market, then that market, grow in this market. It does not go that way.
I think it also plays to London's strengths in a lot of ways, in that the other thing that I observe now, we've been investing in crypto companies for a long time. I think we started the London Bitcoin meetup in 2014 or something. With Imperial College. But one of the things, and I'm sure you have seen this, with probably a better vantage point than almost anyone. But when you go through these hype cycles and then winters, it's easy to get discouraged. But one thing that I find so exciting and moving from a talent investor point of view is when I look at what are the investments we've made in founders that build in this space that have worked? They're actually all the ones that were just trying to fundamentally build real technology.
Interesting. As opposed to...
Well, what I mean is I think at the height of a boom, you do get a lot of froth. Yeah. And I have to say, some of that felt pretty extractive,
Yes, of course it did, yeah.
But, I look at Jensen, I look at Aztec, and I'm like, these are engineering-led companies. They're building incredibly hard products, and that's what gives them the right to win.
Yes.
And I do think, Europe's not that good or hasn't been that good at the hype, frankly. And so in some categories, hype helps a lot. But what I'm really excited about is, I think one of the things that we are really good at in London, in the UK, is science and technology, actually doing hard engineering tasks.
Yes.
And I think that for me, when I think about the future of crypto, I think we just still need a lot of fundamental new technology to make this work.
This is why I'm in the space. This is actually a big reason why I came to the crypto team full time, because of our R&D and research and development side. It's so technological, the depth, that expertise. For those inside, it's phenomenally engineering focused, and I love that kind of building. And I agree with you. And there is, as you said, there's always a frothiness in every cycle, and that's okay, because sometimes that creates the buzz that then brings the people that
crowds in talent, crowds in capital.
And then the few people stay through every cycle, and more people build. And we're in a phase right now where the building and the product, the things that are happening are phenomenal. So my last question for you is, what would you say, given that this is an art, not a science, but I'm going to make it a little scientific for a moment, are the qualities that you see that make someone a good entrepreneur? Or what kind of, in your talent game, what is the quote formula or filter that you use?
I don't think there is a formula, but I think that being exceptional is more of a habit than sometimes we admit.
Yeah.
And what I look for when if I'm interviewing a 21-year-old who's never worked anywhere, never, I'm what I'm always asking is, what have they done, however unrelated to starting a startup, that they had to do on their own volition without anyone telling them.
Yes.
Where they went above and beyond
Yep.
And something happened. Like that idea of agency in the world,
that's pretty
I think
powerful.
is probably the single most important thing.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. It's ambition, yearning, becoming. And I love the line you said about ambition is global, because we're here in the UK. I'm from Silicon Valley, but we're talking about a global phenomenon. Thank you so much for joining this
Thanks
episode,
so much
Matt.
for having
it's
me
so
again.
Great to have you back.
It's great to be here.